safety of our financial institutions, but they should not be used to continue the credit crunch, to stop people from making sensible loans. I'd like for us to not only have welfare reform, but to re-examine the whole focus of all of our programs that help people, to shift them from entitlement programs to empowerment programs. In the end, we want people not to need us anymore. I think that's important. But in the end, we have to get back to the deficit. For years, there's been a lot of talk about it, but very few credible efforts to deal with it, and now I understand why, having dealt with the real numbers for 4 weeks. But I believe this plan does. It tackles the budget deficit seriously and over the long term. It puts in place one of the biggest deficit reductions and one of the biggest changes in federal priorities from consumption to investment in the history of this country at the same time over the next 4 years. Let me say to all the people watching us tonight who will ask me these questions beginning tomorrow as I go around the country and who've asked in the past, we're not cutting the deficit just because experts say it's the thing to do or because it has some intrinsic merit. We have to cut the deficit because the more we spend paying off the debt, the less tax dollars we have to invest in jobs and education and the future of this country. And the more money we take out of the pool of available savings, the harder it is for people in the private sector to borrow money at affordable interest rates for a college loan for their children, for a home mortgage, or to start a new business. That's why we've got to reduce the debt, because it is crowding out other activities that we ought to be engaged in and that the American people ought to be engaged in. Cut the deficit so that our children will be able to buy a home, so that our companies can invest in the future and retraining their workers, so that our government can make the kinds of investments we need to be a stronger and smarter and safer nation. If we don't act now, you and I might not even recognize this government 10 years from now. If we just stay with the same trends for the last 4 years, at the end of the decade, the deficit will be $635 billion a year. Almost 80% of our gross domestic product. And paying interest on that debt will be the costliest government program of all. You'll still be the world's largest debtor, and when members of Congress come here, they'll be devoting over 20 cents on the dollar to interest payments, more than half of the budget to health care and to other entitlements, and you'll come here and deliberate and argue over 6 or 7 cents on the dollar, no matter what America's problems are. We will not be able to have the independence we need to chart the future that we must, and we'll be terribly dependent on foreign funds for a large portion of our investment. This budget plan, by contrast, will by 1997 cut $140 billion in that year alone from the deficit. A real spending cut, a real revenue increase, a real deficit reduction using the independent numbers of the Congressional Budget Office. Well, you can laugh, my fellow Republicans, but I'll point out that the Congressional Budget Office was normally more conservative in what was going to happen and closer to right than previous presidencies. I did this so that we could argue about priorities with the same set of numbers. I did this so that no one could say I was estimating my way out of this difficulty. I did this because if we can agree together on the most prudent revenues we're likely to get, if the recovery stays and we do right things economically, then it'll turn out better for the American people than we say in the last 12 years, because there were differences over the revenue estimates. You and I know that both parties were given greater elbow room for irresponsibility. This is tightening the rein on the Democrats as well as the Republicans. Let's at least argue about the same set of numbers so the American people will think we're straight with them. As I said earlier, my recommendation makes more than 150 difficult reductions to cut the federal spending by a total of $246 billion. We're eliminating programs that are no longer needed, such as nuclear power research and development. We're slashing subsidies and canceling wasteful projects, but many of these programs were justified in their time, and a lot of them were difficult for me to recommend reductions in. Some really tough ones for me personally. I recommend that we reduce interest subsidies to the Rural Electric Administration. That's a difficult thing for me to recommend. But I think that I cannot exempt the things that exist in my state or in my experience if I ask you to deal with things that are difficult for you to deal with. You're going to have no sacred cows except the fundamental abiding interest of the American people. I have to say, we all know our government has been just great at building programs. The time has come to show the American people that we can limit them too, that we can not only start things, but we can actually stop things.
I would like to hang out with him while one of these.
About the defense budget, I raise a hope and a caution. As we restructure our military forces to meet the new threats of the post-Cold War world, it is true that we can responsibly reduce our defense budget. And we may all doubt what that range of reductions is. But let me say that as long as I am president, I will do everything I can to make sure that the men and women who serve under the American flag will remain the best trained, the best prepared, the best equipped fighting force in the world, and every one of you should make that solemn pledge. We still have responsibilities around the world. We are the world's only superpower. This is still a dangerous and uncertain time, and we owe it to the people in uniform to make sure that we adequately provide for the national defense and for their interests and needs.
Yeah. I think so.
Backed by an effective national defense and a stronger economy, our nation will be prepared to lead a world challenged, as it is everywhere, by ethnic conflict, by the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, by the global democratic revolution, and by challenges to the health of our global environment. I know this economic plan is ambitious, but I honestly believe it is necessary for the continued greatness of the United States. And I think it is paid for fairly, first by cutting government, then by asking the most of those who benefited the most in the past, and by asking more Americans to contribute today so that all of us can prosper tomorrow. For the wealthiest, those earning more than $180,000 per year, I ask you all who are listening tonight to support a raise in the top rate for federal income taxes from 31 to 36%. We recommend a 10% surtax on incomes over $250,000 a year. And we recommend closing some loopholes that let some people get away without paying any tax at all. For businesses with taxable incomes in excess of $10 million, we recommend a raise in the corporate tax rate also to 36%, as well as a cut in the deduction for business entertainment expenses.
What's he make
Our
about
plan seeks to
250,000
attack
a
tax
year.
subsidies that actually reward companies more for shutting their operations down here and moving them overseas than for staying here and reinvesting in America.
This is so stupid. These people just passed on the cost to us. I mean, give me a fucking break.
I say that as someone who believes that American companies should be free to invest around the world, and as a former governor who actively sought investment of foreign companies in my state. But the tax code should not express a preference to American companies for moving somewhere else, and it does in particular cases today. We will seek to ensure that through effective tax enforcement, foreign corporations who do make money in America simply pay the same taxes that American companies make on the same income.
We get for America. So we gotta pay for that too. Because all they do is raise the prices.
To middle-class
they don't pay,
Americans
we
who
do.
have paid a great deal for the last 12 years, and from whom I ask a contribution tonight, I will say again, as I did on Monday night, you're not going alone anymore. You're certainly not going first, and you're not going to pay more for less as you have too often in the past. I want to emphasize the facts about this plan. 98.8% of America's families will have no increase in their income tax rate. Only 1.2% at the top. Let me be clear. There will also be no new cuts in benefits from Medicare. As we move toward the fourth year with the explosion in health care costs, as I said, projected to account for 50% of the growth of the deficit between now and the year 2000, there must be planned cuts in payments to providers, to doctors, to hospitals, to labs, as a way of controlling health care costs. But I see these only as a stopgap until we can reform the entire health care system. If you'll help me do that, we can be fair to the providers and to the consumers of health care. Let me repeat this because I know it matters to a lot of you on both sides of the aisle. This plan does not make a recommendation for new cuts in Medicare benefits for any beneficiary. Secondly, the only change we are making in Social Security is one that has already been publicized. The plan does ask older Americans with higher incomes who do not rely solely on Social Security to get by to contribute more. This plan will not affect the 80% of Social Security recipients who do not pay taxes on Social Security now. Those who do not pay tax on Social Security now will not be affected by this plan. Our plan does include a broad-based tax on energy. And I want to tell you why I selected this and why I think it's a good idea. I recommend that we adopt a BTU tax on the heat content of energy as the best way to provide us with revenue to lower the deficit, because it also combats pollution, promotes energy efficiency, promotes the independence economically of this country, as well as helping to reduce the debt. And because it does not discriminate against any area. Unlike a carbon tax that's not too hard on the coal states. Unlike a gas tax that's not too tough on people who drive a long way to work. Unlike an ad valorem tax, it doesn't increase just when the price of an energy source